there was something that we discussed a little bit when I interviewed you previously for my study. You were talking about the negative impacts that occurred because we, as a nation, didn't really understand the battle space historically and culturally that was or is Afghanistan. And so I was wondering if you could discuss that a little bit, because I think it's really an important side conversation that really fills out this idea of battle space.
Sure, happy to. And you mentioned in the introduction that my master's degree is in psychology, and people often ask, why did you do that? And a little bit of serendipity. I was a young instructor pilot, and at that time, the Air Force said we want all our officers to get a master's degree. And so, as often happens, you find the program that's close by. And I was a young dad with a newborn and going to school and flying and doing all that at the same time. And so I pursued that degree in psychology, not knowing that I probably would use those tools more in my career than anything in production and industrial management. Certainly I could look at technical problems and figure out ways to solve those things, but the psychology of your team, the psychology of your environment, the psychology of region of the world that you're about to become engaged in, it's art form. It's not, yes, there is a science, but really it is how you deal with the leadership, the personal issues. Back to my Desert Storm days, between my wife and I, we knew every family story of our 100 people that were deployed with us. Why? Because, we're going to be 15,000 miles away or 12,000 miles away. And we needed to know that a pilot was going to be affected by the fact that his baby's sick at home, and we have no good communications. There's no cell phone. So I know I'm diverging a little bit, but really to say that understanding your people and how they view issues became really valuable later on down the road as we got through 9/11 and began looking at a part of the world that we really had ignored. In fact, we had almost pushed aside as being irrelevant to us. When the Russians left Afghanistan in 1989, the West pretty much said, well, neither Afghanistan nor Pakistan are of any strategic interest to us, so we're going to leave it alone. And I may have said to you once before that think of what might have been different had we and the West put a couple $1 billion worth of aid in there versus just walking away. Important, though, when you walk away, you lose context and content with the history of the people, with the tribal elements that are very real. We didn't understand from a historical context how dividing lines were drawn in a country where we essentially split families from one side of the border in Afghanistan to the other side in Pakistan. And that'll come up later in Iraq. We had really no language speakers for the major languages of Afghanistan. We had almost zero expertise in our State Department and in our Defense Department in that region of the world. We didn't drive our so-called foreign area officers to be experts in that region. We had a very small group of them. So when now, I'll say all of a sudden, we find that a major threat to the U.S. is hosted in a country that we've ignored for, at that point, 15 or 20 years, we're left trying to decide on major issues without the historical context and the political context of where that country is. I mean, if you go back in history, Afghanistan has a proud history as a trading nation. They had great universities. They were well educated, and over a series of a couple decades, allowed they were diminished to a country that had extensive poverty. On 9/11, 50% of Afghanistan was being fed by aid organizations of varying types, AIR and USAID and many others. They had been oppressed by the Taliban, who had been in partnership with the Russians and had been basically taking money from all aspects of the country. You had really three ethnic groups in the north and a fourth in the south, very strong tribal leadership, but identities there. We didn't understand the Tajik strength, if you will, the Kazakh and Tajik relationships weren't necessarily partners, yet they controlled each of them a major portion of the country. And we thought we could overlay on that an American solution. And, oh, by the way, we had no working relationships with any of the countries in the region. So it didn't matter. Pakistan, we had, you might recall, we were holding up a sale of F-16s for about a decade to them. And they were not happy with us. But we needed access through their airspace to be able to get into Afghanistan. We really had no long-standing relationship with Tajikistan or Uzbekistan. And yet, Uzbek and Tajik leaders were critical to how we were going to unfold this plan. So we were trying to do our best at building a plan that could be executed without understanding or having access to the political nuances that really were Afghanistan as a nation. That really put us in a difficult position, and we didn't really know that as we were beginning this operation, because we didn't know the depth of the divisions amongst the tribal factions. We didn't know the political dynamic that was the Taliban and how much they had oppressed the people. We had a sense, but not really. So that really created some challenges. And I'll go back to my comment about half the Afghans were being fed by international organizations. That also affected how you create your battle plan, because those aid organizations have warehouses all over the country. Big food warehouses look a lot like big military warehouses.
Yeah.
They move over roads and bridges throughout the country. Traditional air power doctrine says you make all those go away. Well,
right.
You can't really do that and now not allow the aid to get out. So that actually caused friction within our own coalition. And then you add on to that some 55 or 60 coalition partners who have all stood up to say we want to support the U.S. and the free world in this post 9/11 environment, this war on terror, if you will. And each of them come with their own view of the region, their view of the world politic, their view of national restrictions that they would have to put in place in order to contribute forces or equipment or what have you, or money. And if you didn't have a good understanding of all of those nuances, you talked about a nuanced approach before. This one was extraordinary in that we had a mini UN within our compound at Tampa, plus all of the national agencies, and you had to knit together a strategy and a plan that could be executed while acknowledging each of those concerns. And so, if you didn't, we had our own internal battle space, and we had the external battle space, and you had to try to understand as well as you could each of those in order to be effective and successful. And I think the final challenge of all that is we were not given permission to move our headquarters forward from Tampa into the region until much later in the operations. And so we're conducting command and control from 12,000 miles away, and 7 time zones or 12 time zones or whatever the number was. And that adds its own battle space stress to the environment. So it posed some challenges that we really had not ever had to deal with in the past. And so lesson learned out of that, and what we see today is we are putting in place education programs, strategy programs that deal with that uncertainty. And you're never going to know everything for sure. But if we don't prepare our young leaders to operate in those kinds of geographic environments, we basically tie one hand behind their back before we send them in. A little bit like those 12 special forces guys that we flew into Afghanistan, and we've all seen the movie, but they land in the middle of the night. They have no clue who they're going to meet. They have no clue if they're going to be shot or supported. And yet we ask those young leaders and those young special forces troops to figure it out. And they do, but we probably could have been better at helping them on the front end of that to have a better sense from intelligence and almost psychological reconnaissance that can teach them the things that they might experience and ought to know before entering in.